complexity gets in the way of the storytelling. I think that's where being laser focused in, like, is the idea simple enough to get? Is it going to be memorable? And is it trying not to do too much? You want to try to give them as many messages as possible. That's generally the wrong approach. I think simplicity is the hardest thing. Finding that sweet spot and not overthinking something and not watering down something, you're going to end up, I think, seeing creative get the performance you're after.
On this podcast, we go behind the scenes with industry experts as they break down what it takes to produce creative work that works. If you're seeking insights from some of the sharpest minds of the industry, this is your guidebook to producing creative work that actually delivers. Welcome to the Backcountry Marketing Podcast. My name is Cole Heilborn. Today, I'm sitting down with Dillon Snyder, the creative director at Vail Resorts. Dillon, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks for having me. I'm excited for this conversation.
Likewise. So when you and I first connected, I don't know if it was when the first minute or the first 10 minutes that we were talking, you said, I have this idea. I want to hit the reset button on creative, what it means to be creative. And here we are. We're going to dive into this topic about hitting the button on creative and really trying to unpack what you mean by that. What is the problem that you're seeing? And I don't know, hopefully try to provide a roadmap perhaps for the industry to try and get ourselves out of this creative rut that perhaps we're in. Dillon, give me the thesis statement. Why is this something you think about? Why is this something you want to talk about?
I think the big high level thesis statement is that talking with friends in the industry, seeing the industry after being in it for about 20 years, both on agency side and now on the brand side, that there's so many similar conversations happening. And whether that's if you're a creative, whether that's if you're a brand marketer. And so, but we seem to just keep going year after year on the same cycle. So trying to break some of those cycles and maybe break down some of those barriers that I believe are getting in the way of just getting to creativity, not just creative, but creativity in brand marketing.
So you've been doing this 20 years and you've seen this same cycle for the last 20 years?
I would say it's been slowly growing, right? I mean, so I've been, as especially new technologies, as new medias come in, as we try to scale brands, because there's so many new media placements we have to hit, especially in the digital space, that brands are struggling to keep up, trying to keep their brand as relevant as possible at all times. I think also trying to balance looking at the data, looking at how things are performing, trying to optimize. You got A/B testing, optimizations, right? So you're always trying to put all these inputs together. And in the end, you get something generally kind of homogenized as what we call creative, or the creative output, right? It's there's character count limits that are limiting your creative. And we spend so much time focusing on some of maybe those harder working tactics, we'll say, versus like taking a step back and looking at like, well, what story do we want to tell to our audience? And then when I look at it, I see like, obviously there's a creative perspective, and most creatives want to take that, that grand storytelling approach, push the limits, find the edges of where brand storytelling is. And then obviously, brand marketers might have a different opinion on that and pull it back. And I think it's trying to find where both can be satisfied to help each other get to the places they want to get to. So over my career as a younger creative, always like maybe more frustrated in the like, why didn't that idea or that concept, or why wouldn't they take a risk on that, being the stakeholders or clients. And then as I've grown, realizing like, especially being on the brand side now, I'm like, oh, I can easily see why an agency idea might have fallen down or wasn't presented right. And so many of those great ideas do get lost just based on, I think, the translation from either agency or creative to brand marketer and back and forth.
Okay, man, there's so much to unpack there. So I guess let's just, I don't know. Let's put a disclaimer out there before we dig in. So is this conversation just going to be two people who love great creative griping about great creative or the lack of creative? Like when you're talking amongst friends and colleagues about this problem that you're seeing out there, is it just creative people? I don't want this to be a conversation just creative people just like complaining.
Yeah,
Um,
no.
who are the people that you talk to who see this problem and see what the the cost of this problem truly is beyond just a director or a photographer who wants to make something rad?
Yeah, so no, I think, and that's where I think, even speaking to creatives is kind of growing beyond that. Like, hey, my idea didn't happen. I don't think it's about that at all. I think it's um, there's a ton of costs at it. So obviously the cost of doing the work, the cost of everyone's energy to get a creative from brief to execution, and ensuring the vision still holds up. So, um, while being flexible on growing that and growing that in the right reason. So yeah, I take it more. Uh, I'm taking it from a point of view of like hopefully bringing worlds together a little bit. So definitely not a creative like I'm frustrated that my creative didn't go forward, and more so realizing that it's this idea of like building together, and getting out of some of the practices that I think hold us back as either the as just creatives, as pure creatives, and then also then how to translate that creative into a commercial product that's actually sellable, helping tell that story of a brand, and having the influence I think we want it to have. So definitely taking it from the creative point of view of like, man, creatives, we hold stuff so tight, so precious. And it's like, no, I don't think that's the way of doing it. I think it's really of like stepping back and saying like, how can we help maybe bridge some gaps or tear down some walls and say, yeah, like a brand marketer is going to have some expertise that's going to help move a creative idea forward. And then we're going to respond to that and react to it versus maybe saying like, oh, I don't believe in that direction forward. So that's where I think being on the internal side, seeing that like, hey, we have pure, I've been really enjoying it because we have pure access to like our stakeholders to say, hey, what about this? This idea is half baked. Help me like land this idea in your world and what you're seeing. So that's where I see it going from a creative perspective of like, whether you're in internal shops or whether it's an agency side of like really removing some of the I guess pomp and circumstance of like how we like, the big presentation, and getting more into being comfortable building more in with raw creative ideas and evolving them down the road, because I think ultimately creators will be feel more satisfaction, and brand marketers will feel more satisfaction of seeing those ideas come through together, because if you get too far down an idea, then when you have to either backtrack or pivot, it feels like you're walking away from something that you really hold dear and precious. So
Okay. So with that out of the way, let's dig in. So you've called a lot of the creative that gets produced out there the equivalent of yellow page ads. Can you take us back to kind of like how did we start? Why did we start producing yellow page ads? Can you take us back to the inception or what you think is maybe the inception point for where we are now as an industry?
yeah, no, that's I will definitely define this. And funny enough, just last Friday, I got a yellow page book in the mailbox, which I was like, I didn't even think they still made these things. So obviously, all right, the concept of yellow page ads. Obviously, the yellow pages, the old phone book, the yellow pages being where all the businesses would put their ads. You'd have big ones, small ones. You generally would want to name your company A something like A list plumbing or whatever. So you're at the front of you're at the front of the yellow pages. So really, there's not a lot of creativity. It's filling this space, and you would flip to what you needed when you needed it, and you would call the plumber or the electrician or whatever service you were looking for. So I think in this day and age, saying things, especially like paid social display ads, um, they've been, as we were talking about just a minute ago, they've been like the character counts have been crushed down. You have 30 characters, which again is like almost like an old newspaper way of thinking, right? You're paying by letter. So like we're replicating models that were very, I would say, commodities, right? And we're commoditizing creativity there. So you're really just putting words and pictures together. And obviously, this is at an effort to try to service your message to as many people as possible in the spaces they're frequenting. Um, and I see a need for them. I'm not saying get away from display or some of these lower funnel tactics, but I just see so many brands putting so much energy into creating them where they should almost be like an always on thing. Um, and I think when we put all that energy into creating these lower funnel tactics, we're missing the opportunity to say, what is the problem we're really trying to solve here? Because I don't know if a display ad or a paid media ad is going to necessarily always solve that if there's so many limitations on it. It's more of like keeping your brand top of mind, just like the yellow pages, keeping your brand top of mind. So when I flip into it, the yellow pages, I would see the biggest full page ad, and some of those smaller ads would get dismissed. So it's like, yeah, you got to be kind of the largest one in the room, and that obviously is stilling. Um, there's that can go. We can go down a whole rabbit hole of like how that is budgeted for, needed, but I do think brands could start to dial in where they put their support, where they put their energy, and maybe, at least in my experience, and this goes all the way back to the agency days, not even just at Vail, but um, put their focus on less of these smaller funnel tactics and look at building true brand ideas or solving problems outside of these kind of always on tactics. So basically, I think these more everyday tactics, like we were talking about, become like the yellow pages, of our time and place where now they're just always in our face versus previously you'd have to go to the yellow pages and look them up. But um, hopefully that kind of was answering what you were getting at. But that type of creative, which I see high volumes of, basically, I think the long story short is we put a lot of energy from not only creatives but stakeholders, time and efforts to studio production to trafficking, and it's just like there's got to be a better way of where we put our energy and focus. And hopefully some of those things get turned on and you set it, forget it, and then just kind of monitor them every so often versus putting so much importance on them.
Mm. Yeah, I see. It's so I've heard a lot of um, interesting reports out there about brands who only invest in bottom of the funnel type content like you're describing while ignoring top of the funnel brand. And one of the biggest symptoms that I've heard, and I'm curious what you've noticed or seen out there, is the like the one time buy customer. Like a customer gets hit with an ad, they go buy a thing, but there's no loyalty, there's no repeat purchase, there's no lifetime value associated with that customer. And so it's you're spending that money for that one time purchase, but you haven't gained a customer who will consider you in the future. That's something I've been chatting with a few different brands about that they've been seeing and experiencing um, without because they're not investing in that top of funnel.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. And loyalty is one of the most expensive things, in marketing to get. You have to generally spend more money to either retain or convince someone to like really commit to your brand. Especially, I would say, brands in the outdoor space or less of the CPG stuff, I think, but more of like the experiential brands or maybe even like clothing brands, gear brands. And that can have a number of factors, but I completely agree. And I think that's where, when you look at that lower funnel activation, you are kind of competing against everyone. And hopefully your ad gets served. And hopefully, and then, it maybe grabs someone's attention. But then it's got to maintain. And I think that's where it's like, well, what is your brand doing after you've hooked me? Because yes, I'm definitely clicked on many a paid social ad and bought products and then follow up with that product. But it becomes almost utilitarian versus in some products you invest in or they invest in their above the funnel or their storytelling, even if it's in just the digital space. And you start to become part of that brand, or you feel like you're representing that brand. And so they're obviously solving a problem, a bigger problem in the marketplace, or they understand how to connect with their guest or their consumer. So that's where I think there's a ton of value in that. And yes, I think getting those quick short term sales are almost like an impossible task to kind of keep up with. Um, and that's where I think a lot of brands get into that, cycle of like trying to cycle numbers. Like we had a great year. How are we going to top it? Well, let's, you know, keep hitting this. We got to keep those ads on, and that cost, just comes with time and burden. And like, is it really working? And are we actually getting the data we need? Where I do think then brands need to, have that balance of like that confidence to tell other stories, that risk to tell other stories, to hopefully then again remind people why you fell in love with the brand in the first place or purchase that brand in the first place. So I think that's where, in a sacrifice of media dollars, marketing dollars, storytelling gets kind of like, I think, first cut. Because sometimes that value is a long run play versus short run play.
Well, it's almost always a long-term play, it seems
Yes.
like. I don't know anyone who's had a short-term gain from a brand storytelling approach. You mentioned problem solving. So what are good problems that brand storytelling can solve, and what are poor problems, if I can phrase it that way?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think and you summed it up right there. I think trying to even have the conversation that, because storytelling gets put out there all the time. We hear this word all the time. And I think when talking to marketers, try to frame it up as, it's not just like, oh, I'm creating a fun story and that's great. It's storytelling essentially at its roots is problem solving, just like you said, right? So any good story, if you're reading a book, a great story is going to solve a problem, and that's hopefully kind of the enjoyment of it. So reminding marketers, that's why we love storytelling and that it can solve their problems. So as far as good problems to solve, I think it's like understanding, um, again, it could be from a number of angles. So understanding your guest or your audience and saying what's going on in their life and how can our product solve a problem for them or change a behavior for them that will help their life, or impact their life in a way that, we believe that they'll get enjoyment out of it and see reward. Um, but then on the flip side of that, I think, for brands themselves, it's like, okay, for example, a bad problem to solve is in a brief is around the idea of like, hey, we want to drive sales or we want to grow our audience. That's not a problem to solve that storytelling is going to probably help you with. So I think it's like a good problem to solve there would be like, okay, well, our sales are down, and we want to drive sales. Um, but how can we position our product in a way, to maybe disrupt or get in someone's mind differently? I think a great example, just saw it, we were talking about internally was, and I don't know if this was their problem to solve, but it was the Cheetos Netflix partnership in New York, and they were promoting the Wednesday show, right? The show Wednesday coming up, and Cheetos took over Times Square, and the hand from the Addams families, like, right, putting Cheeto fingers everywhere. And when I think about it, I'm like, okay, well, this is fun. It's interactive. It's obviously a huge production budget, media budget. So I get they had that support. But the problem to solve is, to me, for that brand Cheetos, is when you sit down and binge watch shows, you're eating other snacks. You're eating popcorn probably or other things. So how can Cheetos then say, how can we be in the consideration set for people when they're watching TV and at home? We're not just a lunchbox snack. So I would hope that that's something like that came along with them and says, we want to be top of mind and solve that problem for our brand to insert ourselves into kind of the, evening TV binge watching, format. So to me, that's like a good problem to solve. And then hopefully that then leads to their sales going, increasing. So hopefully they develop storytelling around that, obviously with that execution. So that'd be like one example of a brand kind of saying like, okay, we can get to good sales, hopefully based on, an idea that says consumers change your behavior on how you use this product or think of this product.
And I think it's amazing too, the more specificity you have of the problem that you're solving, the more creative you can be, and then the easier it is to actually measure the results of what you're doing. To your point, if you're like, we just need to drive awareness to the website, how are you going to do that? But if you can get really granular and say, like for instance, we're working on a project right now, and the whole goal is to go after this one audience, a very specific audience, and build an emotional connection and relationship with this audience. And so our whole campaign is built around like helping this audience feel seen, telling stories that reflects this audience in the storytelling and building that relationship between the two. When you get really granular, I think then you can come up with some really unique ideas. But if you're just speaking very high level, it's hard to come up. It's like you're like, what story do we tell? How do we? Where does it go? What's the format? How long is it? Like all those things are hard to pinpoint if you don't know exactly what you're solving.
And that's a great point. I love that point there with the example you're saying is because you're creating a community. Right? You're not trying to go after everyone. You're not trying to say, hey, is this going to have mass appeal? You're really, to your point, you're zeroed in and focused. And again, it's something that is hard to do is to say, we want this to resonate with 4 out of 10 people or 5 out of 10 people and not 10 out of 10 or 9 out of 10. And we're okay leaving those people behind because we know that the people we're resonating with will, one, really appreciate it. Two, they'll probably be ambassadors for us and bring the others in. So I love that mentality of having the confidence of brands that can do that and just say, we know who we want to speak to, and we know that that is going to be a very pointed message and a very targeted message. Yeah. So then you can really, hopefully, as we're talking dollars and cents, like make your marketing go further because you really are zeroed in on that audience and you're reaching them versus hoping you're reaching them.
What litmus tests do you have personally to try and determine like have we reached the root problem? Or do we need to dig deeper? Because there's kind of that methodology of like ask why 3 or 4 times,
Yeah.
and then on the fourth why, you've kind of exposed the root problem. Like, are there any other tips or tricks that you have that folks could try and implement?
Yeah. I mean, I think something I've done, and this is probably a very common one, I think, for creative practice is, um, I think as you get a brief, separating it out and like saying, okay, here's one, here's the problem. Okay. It's articulated, let's say, really clearly, but then I'm going to attack it this one way. And I'm going to go down and you're going to get your first thoughts. You're going to get your obvious stuff that I think people really resonate with. Right. And then you're going to keep pressure testing that in that one territory and say, like, what are other articulations of that? What's another insight of it? What if I flipped it and looked at it from, um, the inverse of what I'm attacking? If someone said, hey, um, I look at it from a different point of view. So that's one territory. And I think you go down and you really try to wring out all the ideas, and different directions that it could go from that one territory. And then you do it again and say, okay, set that aside, right? And like, make sure we're going in a completely different direction and are looking at the problem from a different angle altogether. And then going down that, almost formulaic approach and saying, while we might be letting go of what option one was solving, and because it can't do everything, but we think option two will give us that stronger approach. So honestly, it's really, I think, being disciplined with creativity and saying like, have we explored all the territories out there, or enough territories to say after looking at all these 5 or 6 different territories, these two maybe overlap, these two maybe are like the weaker ones in the mix. But generally something comes out of that. Some aha moment comes out of that.
And you mentioned an aha moment. Is that what you're looking for when you feel like you've unearthed the true problem? Does it click? Do you feel it?
You can definitely feel it. You can feel when something's not right. Like you can feel like, all right, we're forcing something here. Um, and I think personally, I'm always like, maybe it is good, and we just got to keep pushing on it, right? And maybe it's not good, and we should just walk away from it. And I think that's the hard part of like at some point just being okay to walking away, and then at some point saying, no, this is the idea, and let's build upon it. Versus like again, the going back to the territory thing, you could have endless territories, but at some point you do have to kind of focus and narrow that focus because otherwise you'll almost burn yourself out in the first phase. There is those moments where you're like, this is it, this is gold. And we've had multiple of those, obviously through. And then some campaigns you get something that like solves the problem. Is it going to be maybe like some massive award winning campaign? No, but that's okay. It still solved the problem and did it in a creative way, even if it maybe didn't reach the upper echelon of like creativity and awards and all that. So I think it's being okay with that. Not every problem has to be this revolutionary idea. You can
Sure.
solve problems generally pretty quickly with some really strong creative thinking, but it doesn't have to, be revolutionary.
So, you can identify the problem and have a great problem to be solved, but if you as a team aren't given enough time to focus on that problem, then you're just kind of fishtailing and chasing various things. How important, because I'm assuming like a lot of this come, at least in your position, a lot of this comes down from leadership and they're like, let's focus on this. How important is focus internally on a problem in solving that problem, and how much time is enough time? When have you spent enough time trying to solve that problem before you move to another one? How do you think through kind of like the runway needed to solve these things?
Yeah, and obviously this is kind of the canned answer that is like, yeah, it's gonna vary between on the problem to solve and the level of like the impact we believe it's gonna have on the business. But I do think any problem can be solved quickly, and there is a level of time that you want for deep thought, exploration, let it marinate, all that. But ultimately, too much time, I think, can be just as bad for a creative. Either there'll be a level of procrastination because something else will come up and get in the way of it and a distraction. Um, so, I think again, that's where I don't want to use like the sprint agile method. I'm not a big proponent of that when it comes to creativity. I think there's a time and place for that, and if you need it, you can turn it on and do it. We're just getting through projects that have done that, and I think at the end you get to a nice quality product. You did it efficiently. Everyone's like, wow, that was a really hopefully efficient process. Everyone banded together, but you want to find that sweet spot in time. I like to say, let's say it's a normal high level project, like a big campaign coming out, in a couple of months down the road. Um, I'd say give the team a week, right? Creatives a week. There's no hard and set fast, but give creatives a week. Check in during that process. See what's on the paper. See what ideas are rising up, and then help focus thinking, saying like, so again, kind of a traditional method of like ideate fast, clear stuff that's and help shape and move stuff. And then I think start bringing in stakeholders earlier and often to see if things are on track. Yeah, too much time can definitely be a curse to creative. And not enough time. Mm, I'd rather have less time, I guess, as a
Okay.
creative,
Okay. Fair enough.
um, because I think there's just less of room to then overthink it.
I see. So I'm thinking about creatives in terms of like two different categories. There's and one person could fulfill both of these. But there's the creative who produces something, that comes up with a vision, has the output, and then there's the piece of the creative that is identifying the problem, the true problem, and then pairing that with a solution. Does our industry look at them does our industry look at creatives as outputters rather than people who can find the real problem and then come up with the solution?
That is a great question. It's a tricky one for sure. I think that's definitely at the heart of what we were talking about earlier with lower funnel stuff. Like, hey, I just need someone to put words and pictures together and like make it look beautiful, make it sound amazing, make it be clever, whatever the brand voice is. But yes, we get too caught up in the I need executioners. Um, and again, I think that's where, um, especially internally, and it happens at the agency side as well, but like bringing creatives in onto the briefing and the brief creation process. Um, I think even, and we do it here, and we're getting better at it, is bringing our creative team in on the marketing planning process to help find where those unique spaces are. Like, okay, well, what are you planning on doing today to drive someone, or what are you planning on doing this year to drive someone to a resort or get them interested in a resort or excited about a resort? And that's when we start to say, well, okay, well, we have this feature or this product. And it's like, those are all campaigns, and we should build those campaigns out in a way instead of like maybe crushing them all into one campaign and trying to over deliver messages to be efficient or fear that we're not going to say something to the person at the right time or place. So I think we're getting better at creative coming in and saying like, hey, let's figure out what your creative campaign schedule is looking like. So yeah, I think creatives in briefs don't wait for the brief. Yeah, I feel I've seen it so many times. Internal, external, we creatives wait to the brief, and then the creatives don't like the brief, or they ignore the brief. So that's what I think. Again, having like these creatives are going to think a certain way, brand marketers are going to think a certain way. Putting those together in a room earlier, and often you're going to end up getting to stronger creative work to solve those problems. And again, when I say this, I'm not saying even like this is going to be award-winning work or anything like that, but the team is going to be happier with the outcome. You're probably going to be achieving the results you're after, even if that is just, more of a business result versus like a creative accolade. Honestly, I think everything starts to come hand in hand. So yeah, I think getting creatives into that briefing process sooner ultimately helps them start to see where the true problems are, even if they're not being fully articulated.
How do you define creative? Because I mean, even in this conversation, we're using it as an adjective and as a noun.
Yeah.
But in the case of brand marketer and creative, where you're talking about bringing them together to build a brief, who is a creative in your opinion?
So yes, there's the traditional sense of creatives, the art directors, copywriters, associate creative directors, but um, and they might be tasked with being a creative, but I think there's plenty of like account people, brand people, everyone. I'll just say this sounds like probably a little generic, but I think everyone has creativity, creative, or can be creative minded. I think creatives, the noun version, they're hired to kind of take all this input and simplify it so that then when it's spit back out or shared with an audience, it's done in a way that makes them think, catches their attention, makes them change a behavior. So ultimately, a creative as a noun, I think, is a problem solver, a person that can problem solve and create simplicity from a complex inputs. Um, and I think to varying degrees, everyone has a little bit about that in them. I'll go off on a little tangent here. One of my biggest pet peeves is in the industry is so I have a copywriter background, came up as a copywriter. I've heard it all my life. That, this phrase will come up of, I'm not a copywriter, but um, and then someone will say what they want to say, or they'll, articulate it. And I'm like, that's okay. Don't have to put the qualification of I'm not a copywriter. Right? Like everyone has probably have some writing training or grew up maybe even a journalism background, English background, or just has ideas on words and how to write words, even if they aren't the final person to do it. So that's where I like to um, try to get rid of the labels of it and say like, yes, if you have ideas on copy, let us know and we can say that might be that was a great idea. I didn't think of that, and that's okay. Or we can take the idea of it and say, hey, I took your idea and here are some other articulations of what you were trying to say or communicate in a way that I think will, land with this audience. And here's why, whether that's connected to a cultural insight, whether that's just maybe sharper language, less generic language. So long story short, I think creatives ultimately are beyond just copywriters and art directors. They are ideally, hopefully, if they're set up in the right manner, solving problems in a simple way.
Hmm. A simple way.
A simple way.
That's an interesting tag to the solving problem part. Why emphasize in a simple way?
I think the big thing is like complexity gets in the way of the storytelling. And that means like the more you're trying to, obviously, I think, there's tons of studies. We hear it all the time. You're fed whatever, like, I'm going to make up some number that's not accurate. So no one quote this, but like you're fed like 15,000 ads a day, right? Or something like that.
I think it's 7 to 10.
7 to 10. Okay.
You're close.
Yes. So you're in 7 to 10 ads a day, and that's a lot of noise. That's a lot of complexity. That could be a lot of visuals. That's a lot of words being thrown at you. We hear it all the time when people say, oh, I saw that funny ad, and then they attribute it to the wrong brand. And you're like, that's got to be the worst, because you're like, oh, you broke through with the funniness, but then now someone else is getting the credit. Um, so I think that's where just being laser focused in like, is the idea simple enough to get? Is it going to be memorable? And is it trying not to do too much? I think that's one of the things is like, again, going back to it is like, you only have so much space with someone or time. And so you want to try to give them as many messages as possible. But that's generally the wrong approach. That let them find other, give them the breadcrumbs and they will eventually, find the messages that they need if you're giving them the most desirable one first. So I think simplicity is the hardest thing to do and to walk away from. And then sometimes even a creative idea just gets too conceptual, too heady. And you're like, okay, this is in a world where I am getting inundated with all sorts of things beyond ads, just my daily life. Like, don't make me decipher your ad unless you're The Economist. But even their ads are great too, right? Like The Economist has great, simple ads that are make you think and relate to their brand. But I think that's the thing is just don't make people work hard for it, but trust their intelligence as that your audience that you're talking to, and finding that sweet spot, and not overthinking something and not watering down something. Again, you're gonna end up, I think, seeing creative get the performance you're after.
Hmm. But isn't that an opportunity? You're saying like don't make them think. Sometimes the best stuff is the stuff that makes you think.
So yes, I'll backtrack on that. Yes, I want someone to think, but I don't want them to be confused by it, I guess. I don't want them to be like, what was the point of this? What was I supposed to take away from this? They should hopefully, if it's even if like, and that's I think going back to our other conversation, even if like 6 of 10, 5 of 10 get it, and maybe someone else is like, I don't get that ad. Even we'll just go in the classic Super Bowl scenario of like you're sitting next to a friend, someone's laughing their face off at an ad, the other person's like, I don't get it. And that's okay because some person did get it and some person it probably just wasn't tailored for them or their lifestyle or what they're consuming in culture. So definitely want them to think, and I think getting that reaction, you'll get your audience to think and hopefully change the behavior and do something. But hopefully it's not at the point where they're like, I am so confused what you want me to do because you've now given me maybe 3 tasks within this ad to do.
Sure.
And I think that's more of it. It's just like making sure messaging is super pointed and sharp, clear, and that the visuals and the creative together enhance that story.
All right, so let's just dream and let's say that you find this reset button and you smash it and like what would you want to see industry wide that that would that would change? Like what do you see actually changing or hope that would change?
I think the big thing is one for creatives, just because creatives I think are naturally well, they can be introverted or whatever. There's all types of creatives out there, but I think just greater collaboration and creatives being open to that collaboration. I almost want creatives to invite stakeholders in, clients in, and saying like, let's do this together. Let's build this together. I don't need to go off necessarily right away and go into a whole in concept or in a room with my art director or copywriter. Um, you know, so I would want to almost change the creative process for that, right? And goes, I mean, not to go super back, but like to the Bernbach days where art and copy were separated, right? And copy would go down to the art directors, and then he was like, bring them together. And so, in a history of creative, it's when you bring things together, you generally can work and build creative solutions together. But that is the hardest part, right? Because there's friction there, there's tension there, there's going to be debates. Even with like art directors and copywriters, there's always like, well, no, I don't like that because of this, and no, I do like that. So I think as humans, that part is what keeps us from doing that. Is that there's like, oh, this is going to be uncomfortable, or um, like maybe in some cases people do want people just to go away and bring them back the answer, but then when they get it, it's not the answer they wanted. So that's where it's like realizing that we're going to be spinning our wheels a lot less if we just um again find different ways to connect and those disciplines now that I think have gotten more sophisticated. First, the Bernbach days of advertising, which are long gone and way past us. So um yeah, I think that's the big one. If we could hit a reset button, is kind of restructuring, whether you're at an agency and working with a client, which we still use a lot of agencies even with an internal shop, or you're at an internal shop, is just like finding a way to make the process make people connect versus just like, hey, I kicked it off and then in 3 weeks I'm going to see some work.
Hmm.
um
Well, there's that are you familiar with this quote from Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast? That idea?
Say it again. Culture.
Culture eats strategy for breakfast?
I have not heard that, but yeah, I love that quote.
Yeah, I've it's come up before on our show, and I think it's attributed originally to this business consultant, Peter Drucker. Yeah, but the whole idea is like you could have the smartest people in the room trying to develop the smartest strategy, but if the culture doesn't exist for those people to actually work well together, or to entertain friction, or to handle debate and disagreement well, the none of it matters.
Exactly. And that takes work. And I think that's where I think the work needs to be put in. I know there's like people can get to good ideas. There's tons of good ideas. We can get to fun, clever cultural references. Um, I mean, I don't think that's the hard part. I think the hard part is making everyone get in the same boat and row together and um, kind of disrupting the flow of what a traditional creative process looks like.
So let's say that creatives come together, right? We've got all these different divergent thinkers, um, all working together, and your reset button has worked, and everyone can like can mesh well and work well together. What impact does that have on the work and from the public facing, how they receive that work that then is the output of those teams? Like, what are they seeing? What could they expect to see that's different than what they're seeing currently?
That's a tough question in the sense that I know so much is controlled by media, and there's some things that maybe can or can't. But I do think if like, um, I think you're gonna start to see some of the, not, I'd see more of the traditional stuff that we're used to, whether that's film storytelling, whether that's narrative storytelling. Um, and I think you're gonna show up in lives differently than um, in the social spaces and things like that. I think we'll find new avenues to show up in people's lives. I think there's a craving for that, right? It's like, you know, we haven't really touched on it and probably won't go too deep into like AI and the topic there, but like just with being right now in the current state with like every time you open social media, this is like my wife sent me this last night. Hopefully, this isn't too much of a tangent, but she sent me this video last night of like rabbits jumping on a trampoline. And she's like, "Is this real?" I'm like, "No, this is not real." It was like hidden camera footage of rabbits jumping on this trampoline. And I'm just like, I'm so done with just like, these are silly. That's fun. It's kind of entertainment. But I'm like, oh my God, everything is like, so I think we're going to see just a craving of like getting back to some of those real placements and interacting probably more in real life. And you're going to probably see executions of like, how can we reach people, maybe not the masses, because we can turn on that other stuff to reach the masses. How can we maybe interact in a smaller scale? So I'm going to say, if, maybe this is just contrarian. If everyone's scaling, I'm going to say let's descale and find those places to show up in people's lives in a way that then obviously has that impact, that greater impact, and is done well, and it feels like it's really making a meaningful connection. Because yeah, I think we know we can turn on media really quickly. We know if you do an activation, it's probably going to get picked up and shared, and the film is going to be online, and that's how most people are going to interact with it. But I do think there is a value of like saying, how can we descale a little bit to show up in people's lives a little bit more authentically?
I would say like most people hope that that's true. But also
Yeah.
I don't know, the what's the word I'm looking for? The narcissist? That's not the word. I also don't know if that will be true. Like I think and we've talked about this. I did an episode with Bronwyn Foster Butler, the CMO at Finisterre surf company out of the UK.
Yeah.
And we were kind of talking about like AI and authenticity and will it push people towards real, or do people even care? And she's like, I don't know that the average consumer will actually care whether it's AI produced or not. Um, from a brand perspective, we can't necessarily show up and say that we care about natural, real places and then go create a photo shoot
Yeah.
using an AI engine. Like that doesn't
That doesn't
that doesn't
commute. Yeah.
align. But I think it's similar to the question of, well, how many consumers actually care about sustainability? How many of them actually care about environmental practices or business practices with the environment in mind? Many people say they do, but do their purchase habits actually align with how they project or their virtue signaling? I would assume not. I'd love to see some reports on that. But I think I would assume it's going to be similar to the AI content. Like, I don't know that people are really going to care. And it hurts me to say that.
No, that's a good point. And yeah, I do think as far as AI, I think that's like right now, the, as it's been stated, like the new internet, right? Like it's everyone's playing with it. We're making it hallucinate. It's fun. It's breaking. It's just like fun to try to break it and tease it, and then it'll eventually probably flow more naturally in, and yeah. And I don't think they're gonna care on that sense, but I do think I'd be interested to see, and again, not all products, not all industries, but if there is this kind of like craving, and this is where it gets tricky, I guess, because we talk about personalization a lot, and I think that's still kind of like
Mm.
um a tough topic, because personalizations becomes almost, it also wants to scale and be automated, but I'm like, that's almost the opposite of personalization. I feel like it's just like almost like a generic personalization, which is some kind of oxymoron, I guess. So that's where I do think there might be a resurgence, hopefully, of the more one-to-one contact. And I think we saw this in the mid 2000s a little bit with like, the resurgence of like the makers movement. And I think that's come and gone for sure, but I think there'll always be kind of a cycle to it of like, okay, I want to unplug a little bit. So I'm hoping as certain brands do that, as they look for personalization, they like say, hey, I want to invest in certain ways that I know this is probably not going to reach every person or the masses, but hopefully it reaches the right audience in a way, or even is more, I don't know, um, not just feel like mass manufactured.
Yeah. Well, I think the one thing that I've I'm curious to hear your thoughts on, and like something that I've been kind of trying to just communicate is like people don't care. Your audience doesn't care, your customer doesn't care, and I think it's even going to be more compounded with all of the AI slop, as people are calling
Yeah,
it. Um, like people are going to become like their tolerance level is going to become that much more. Uh, their skin will become thicker, and so it becomes that much more difficult as a brand to actually produce something that does make that gives people a reason to care, that builds that connection, that builds that relationship. Uh, and while it might be more of a challenge, it's also an opportunity, right?
100%.
Um,
Yeah.
but to this point of our conversation, I do wonder how many brands will actually invest in that opportunity and do the hard work.
No, I'm with you there. And I mean, 100%. Like, yes, no, maybe few, but probably not. No consumers are waking up being like, oh, let me go check in on my favorite brand, right? Or I can't wait till they drop that ad. Um,
Which there are brands that do that well, and people do look for that stuff.
oh yeah. Exactly. And
I mean,
they seek it out. And then we have that conversation too. Um, all the way down to even certain brands that, I was talking to our copywriter and she's like, yeah, she likes the brand. It's like a woman's clothing brand, but she's like, I just love their emails. So I just like, I just want to read all their emails because they're written so well. And they're always very culturally relevant. And so, that's the kind of thing I think more of is brands like, you know, not overthinking an email and saying like, hey, like it's an email. I'm going to send out bazillions of these. Let's go have a little bit more fun with it. And if I miss a message, I'll send it out in the next one. Um, so I think it's like just brands being a little bit, I guess, more interesting with even some, maybe that's what I'm trying to get at. Being a little bit more interesting with some of those, even their own channels or even their, paid media channels that have become stale and becoming wallpaper or the yellow pages of of marketing, um, to hopefully again catch someone's attention and have that conversation with them in a way that's like, oh man, I didn't think a display ad would actually catch my attention or make me laugh or but that one did. So I think that's where it's like seeing where we can have that impact because yes, I agree. Like most people are very good at tuning out marketing, and the ones that do it right are you're generally getting, um, you might be relevant for a day, a week, and then you've moved on, and then you're like, well, what's next? And that's I think being okay with like not having to fill that space either of what's next. Like plan out your story, plan out your narratives, so you actually do have what you believe is engaging content in the pipeline versus trying to react to everything or be timely every day of the week.
so for brands that are listening and they want to break out of the yellow pages and do something, anything different, what would if you had to kind of summarize everything we've talked about and all the things that they could consider and try and implement? How would you try and send them off on their day?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, and you hear it a lot, and I know it's been on a lot of your podcasts, but just in this day and age, and it kind of dovetails into the AI conversation, is if people aren't going to care, is then without being reckless, embrace the risk, take a leap. Odds are some people will notice and enjoy it. Odds are maybe a lot of people won't notice, and it didn't have the damage you were fearful of, right? So I think that's where it's like, obviously take that risk, um, build it together with creative, understand the risk you're taking, but be more risky. I mean, like, AI is like, I guess, proven that to, like, you can type in anything and then you get the most wild idea, most risky idea ever. That I'm like, so this is like non-branded content. That stuff is like bonkers. So as a brand, you're probably, unless you're just like really not paying attention, you're probably not going to offend anyone. You're probably not going to misstep. And you're probably going to get inserted to that conversation in a way that's relevant to your guests or your audience life. So to me, it's just like work together to get to those ideas. Don't settle for the status quo. Um, and then take some swings, because you can keep the status quo. And the yellow pages still shows up in your mailbox, apparently. So it's always going to be there in digital space. It's always going to be there. So take bigger risks elsewhere. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. And it seems like that's a common theme from a lot of creatives right now, is just like the desire to take those, we use the word risk, but they're more just like, I think, calculated brand moves.
Well, the risk isn't taking the risk,
Yeah.
as we've talked about on the show
Yeah.
before, and it's an easy thing to say. Obviously, when there's, a founder is looking at their bottom line and looking at the next quarter, and they're trying to figure out how do we move forwards and stay alive. Like that's a real conversation that's a lot harder to weigh through than just two people like sitting and having a
It is.
conversation.
It is. There's a lot that goes into it, but I think um that's where it's like, if you're solving the right problems, right? And you're telling the right stories that might feel risky or they might feel different, then you'll be all right. I think you'll be all right. And then I think there's other things beyond the creative. And I think the bigger point is like, creative can only do so much, say so much. If it doesn't show up in the right spot, if, the media plan's not right, if maybe the budget was off, if the timing's off, maybe there's a current event that disrupts, this campaign that just like was about to just launch, and then there's your attention's taken elsewhere. So that's where it's like creative can only go so far. And that's where it's like, speaking into the creative is like, that's why it's got to be sharp and pointed. Um, Otherwise, like, I think, if you don't even have that, if you're not even starting with that, you're already starting at kind of a deficit. So, but yes, there are definitely other factors at play, and like how far someone's willing to risk depending on the climate of their business, or, where their brand is going. But sometimes I do think like that is either probably a result of, playing it safe for too long
Sure.
and just kind of like going with the flow, and doing the same process year over year. And then, um, or also if the market's changing, and maybe, yeah, maybe a product is going the way of the blockbuster. So anyway.
There's kind of that quote, maybe to wrap it up here. There's that quote, the best time to plant a tree was yesterday, and the second best time is today. Yeah,
Yeah,
like if you've been running your business and you haven't been investing in brand, like it's not that it's too late, but like you should have been doing it 5 years ago,
exactly.
which
Yeah,
is a tough pill to swallow.
it's a tough pill to swallow. It's not a mountain that can't be overcome, and it doesn't mean that you have to then go even to the other. Like, the pendulum doesn't have to swing all the way to
Right.
the other side. So I think it's really, again, in those situations, trust your team, trust the creatives, trust the team as a whole, and together, I think, again, you'll end up building to the answer you need. And I think on that, I think the last note there is like just making sure as that process does get iterated, that it doesn't just become an echo chamber either, right? So that's always the problem. And I think that's the, where the different disciplines will keep each other in checks and balances of saying like, no, like this isn't going far enough, or this is off, or whatever the case might be. But I think that's just going to be the nature of a creative minded, like a creative noun minded person versus like a brand marketer person. And then the experiences coming together to get to that, ultimately the creativity, storytelling, problem solving we're after in the market.
Dillon, thanks for taking the time. Thanks for sharing some of your perspective and insights that you've learned. I don't know why, but I've never attributed the state of our industry to the yellow pages, but I'm going to adopt that now. And
Yeah, hopefully,
and
yes. As I was preparing for this, I was like, I did it up front of having to kind of explain what the yellow pages were, because as I have grown in my career, I realized some things aren't still relevant or even known. So yes,
and there's not much the yellow pages are good for these days, other than starting a campfire. So if you don't want to be campfire fuel, maybe reach out to Dillon if you're interested and he's willing. Where can people find you if they have further questions they want to talk shop?
yeah, LinkedIn. I'm a pretty easy person to track down. Yeah, Dillon Snyder, LinkedIn, the one that's working for Vail that lives in Colorado. But yeah, always happy to chat, happy to connect. Try to connect with as many people as possible that reach out. Obviously, can't always get to everyone, but yeah, always look forward to different perspectives and making those connections. So definitely don't hesitate.
Incredible. Well, Dillon, thanks so much again for the time. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Cole.
All right, take care.
Bye.